fan, massive movie fan. I used to go to pictures seven days a week. I used to see, there were always lots of films to see. Mind you, there was no television, you know? And so
He has outlived almost everyone he ever shared a film set with. At 93, Michael Caine is one of the last men standing from a generation of British actors who turned working-class accents into a kind of currency in Hollywood. And when he sits down now to talk about his life, he doesn't reach first for the awards or the box office numbers. He reaches for names. Friends. People who are, in most cases, no longer alive to confirm the stories themselves, which is exactly why the way Caine tells them matters so much. Born Maurice Micklewhite in South London in 1933, Caine spent decades building not just a filmography but a private map of loyalties across an industry famous for having none. What makes his story worth examining isn't just the scale of his fame, it's the consistency of the relationships he chose to keep. Investigating those friendships means going back to interviews, memoirs, and the public record left behind by the people themselves, because Caine has never been shy about naming names when asked who mattered most. Unlike so many Hollywood retrospectives that lean on studio-approved anecdotes, Caine's own account of his closest friendships has stayed remarkably stable across 40 years of press appearances, which is itself worth noticing. People rewrite their own history all the time. Caine, by comparison, has told roughly the same stories about the same handful of people since at least the 1990s. The friendship most people know about first is the one with Sean Connery, and it's also the best documented. Both men came up in the same narrow window of British film history, both working class, both determined to break into an industry that had, until then, mostly rewarded a certain kind of polished, upper-crust Englishness. Connery got there first, landing the role of James Bond in 1962, and Caine has said in multiple interviews over the years that watching Connery succeed gave him permission to believe his own accent wasn't a liability. In his memoir, What's It All About?, Caine wrote about the bond between British actors of that era who felt like outsiders storming a closed shop, and Connery was central to that story. Their friendship outlasted decades, survived them starring in different Bond-adjacent corners of the industry, and became the subject of affectionate public teasing about who had actually played the better Bond, a rivalry that was really just two old friends enjoying an argument neither of them took seriously. When Connery died in 2020, Caine spoke publicly about the loss, describing him not as a colleague but as one of his closest friends of over 50 years. That's not sentiment invented for a headline. That's a friendship with a paper trail, one that stretched from struggling young actors sharing meals they could barely afford, to two of the most recognizable faces in the world still finding time to sit together at industry events decades later. Roger Moore is the second name that comes up whenever Caine discusses the people who shaped his years in the business, and here again the record is unusually rich, partly because Moore himself was such a prolific writer of memoirs. In Moore's own books, including My Word Is My Bond, he wrote warmly and repeatedly about Caine, describing their friendship as one built less on film sets and more on dinners, shared holidays, and a similar sense of humor about the absurdity of fame. Caine has echoed that in interviews, describing Moore as someone who never let stardom change how he treated people. The two men moved in overlapping social circles for decades, both eventually living at least part-time outside Britain, both known for treating crew members with the same warmth they extended to directors and producers. When Moore died in 2017, tributes from people who had actually worked alongside him consistently mentioned this same detail, that he made people around him feel comfortable, on set and off it. Caine's own comments after Moore's death focused less on Bond and more on the ordinary kindness of the man, which lines up with nearly everything else written about Moore by people who knew him. It's worth noting how rare that kind of consistency is. Public tributes after celebrity death often blur into generic praise, but the specific detail Caine kept returning to, Moore's habit of putting nervous or younger people at ease, matches almost word for word what other actors and crew members said about Moore across separate, unrelated interviews. That kind of overlap doesn't happen by accident. Laurence Olivier occupies a different kind of space in Caine's story, because the relationship wasn't built on decades of casual friendship, it was built on a handful of intense professional encounters that left a permanent mark. Caine has spoken and written about the anxiety of working near a man who was, by the 1960s and 70s, essentially the standard against which every serious English actor measured himself. The two appeared together in Sleuth in 1972, a film built almost entirely around the tension and chemistry between just two actors, and Caine has described in interviews how nervous he was walking into that project. What stayed with him, by his own account, wasn't intimidation, it was Olivier's preparation. Caine has repeatedly credited Olivier with teaching him, mostly by example, that experience is not an excuse to stop working hard, that even a titan of the stage showed up ready every single day. This isn't a private anecdote invented for effect. It's a theme Caine has returned to consistently across interviews spanning decades, which suggests it left a genuine impression rather than serving as a convenient story. There's a particular version of this story Caine has told more than once, about watching Olivier run lines alone in a corner of the set between takes, well after he had already proven himself the greatest stage actor of his generation. For a younger Caine, still uncertain of his own place in the industry, that image apparently mattered more than any single piece of advice Olivier could have given him directly. Shirley MacLaine is the name that tends to surprise people, mostly because audiences don't automatically associate Caine with American actresses of her generation. But the two co-starred in Gambit in 1966, a stylish heist comedy that gave them extended time together on set, and by multiple accounts the chemistry between them off-camera outlasted the production itself. Caine has spoken about MacLaine's curiosity, her willingness to ask questions and actually listen to the answers, and framed it as a rare trait in an industry full of people more interested in being heard than in hearing anyone else. Their friendship persisted for decades afterward, resurfacing in interviews on both sides whenever either was asked about people who mattered to them in the business. MacLaine, for her part, has spoken about Caine with similar warmth in her own public appearances, describing him as someone who treated the work seriously without ever losing his sense of humor about himself. What's notable is that neither actor has ever needed the other to promote anything in order to bring up the friendship. It surfaces in interviews unconnected to any joint project, decades after Gambit left theaters, which is usually a reliable sign that a relationship outlived its professional usefulness a long time ago. What ties these four relationships together isn't simply that they happened, but what Caine has chosen to emphasize when he talks about them. He rarely leads with the films. He leads with small, specific, almost mundane details. Who made people laugh, who remembered names, who showed up prepared, who asked real questions instead of performing interest. That pattern says something about what actually sustains a friendship across a 50 or 60-year career, particularly one lived partly in public. Awards get boxed up. Films get reissued, restored, occasionally forgotten. The relationships, if they were real to begin with, are the only part of a long career that doesn't depreciate. There's also something notable in who Caine doesn't spend as much time discussing. He's worked with an enormous number of famous names across nearly 200 films, and yet the ones he keeps returning to in interviews are a relatively small, consistent group. That consistency is its own kind of evidence. People inflate stories about fame all the time, but they rarely maintain the same short list of names, unprompted, across 4 decades of interviews, unless something in those relationships was genuinely durable. It's a detail easy to miss unless you actually go back and compare the interviews side by side, the way this investigation has, but once you notice it, the pattern is difficult to dismiss as coincidence or good publicity management. At 93, Caine has outlived Connery, Moore and Olivier, and by his own account, MacLaine remains one of the people he still speaks to. What's left, in the end, isn't a highlight reel. It's a smaller, quieter inventory of people who happened to be standing next to him when the cameras weren't rolling, which is, if his own interviews are any indication, the only inventory he's ever really cared about keeping. That's the part of longevity nobody prepares you for, not the fading spotlight, but the slow accumulation of empty chairs where old friends used to sit. Caine has spent the better part of a decade attending fewer premieres and more funerals, and yet what comes through in how he talks about it isn't bitterness. It's gratitude, oddly undiminished by loss. He seems to understand something that took most of his contemporaries a lifetime to learn, that the films were always just the excuse. The friendships were the point. And for a man who has spent 93 years being watched, it's strangely moving that what he once remembered isn't the performance at all. It's the people who were there before the cameras rolled, and stayed long after they stopped. In an industry built almost entirely on image, that may be the most honest thing Michael Caine has ever offered an audience. Not a performance, but an accounting of who actually mattered, told plainly, by a man who has earned the right to stop pretending otherwise.